Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, Episode 70, Toulon, a Harbour of Discontent. In the last episode, we examined the fractures of the First Coalition. Divided by suspicion and rivalry, the great powers of Europe were unable to focus on the threat of Republican France. In this episode, discord will remain the norm, this time in France itself. A community with a history like no other, Toulon's experience of the revolution was unique, contradictory, and violent. Defined in almost every way by the domineering presence of the navy, Toulon's history is both fascinating and unexpected. Before we can see Napoleon's triumph, we must understand how this most atypical community embraced the white banner of royalist insurrection. But before we get into it, a humongous warship-sized thank you to those people keeping Grey History on the air. Please sponsor the show today and help do your part to create history that isn't black and white. With bonus episodes, episode extras, ad-free listening, and a range of other perks, help be the change you want to see and help produce history that isn't oversimplified. There's links in the show notes and on the website, and Apple Podcast listeners can also subscribe to the new community membership on Apple Podcasts, set at the True Revolutionary tier. Please note that for those people who do support the show directly on Apple Podcasts, your information is anonymous. So in order for me to personally thank you in a future episode, I will first need you to drop me a message on social media or the website letting me know your name. I can then make sure you're on the email list for future updates, live video calls, the membership chat room, etc., etc. There's a link to the contact form in all episode descriptions. Now, speaking of new members of the show, it is with great pleasure that I get to introduce the newest members of the community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Brian, Liz, and Louise. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Brooke, Bex, Ronnie, and Uzi. As always, you can't have a revolution without champions, and it's a pleasure to welcome Cameron to the ranks of the champions of the people. Cameron joins the amazing Cindy, George, Mark, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Kevin, Carl, Jeff, Ritus, Hannah, Tyrone, and Jen. Finally, an enormous thank you to the enormously generous heroes of the revolution who have now been joined by Fernando and Hilberto. Both Fernando and Hilberto join the amazing pantheon of greats, the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, and Howard. Of course, thank you to every single member of the community, as this wouldn't be possible without you. Also, a huge thank you to those helping Grey History in any way, shape, or form, including sharing the show with friends and family, mentioning the show on Reddit and social media, leaving written reviews, and sending in one-time donations. Thank you so much for your support of the show. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. In June 1793, Vice Admiral Sir Samuel Hood sailed into the Mediterranean Sea. Accompanied by a fleet of almost 20 warships, Hood was now in command of British forces in the theatre. Arriving at Gibraltar on the 20th, Hood turned his attention to his orders. First and foremost, Hood was to engage the enemy fleet stationed in Toulon. That, however, was easier said than done. The British had scarce intelligence about the state of their foe, nor did they have a way to lure the French from the safety of the well-fortified harbour. Should it remain there, Hood was to secure mastery of the sea. In that capacity, the British would protect Allied shipping, support Allied kingdoms, and most importantly, starve the enemy into submission. Unfortunately for the French Republic, southern France was particularly vulnerable to an effective blockade. Unable to grow sufficient food for its inhabitants, the region had long been dependent on imports from abroad. As such, the British wasted no time in instituting aggressive measures, severing French connections to both Africa and Italy. Controversially, not even neutral shipping would be left untouched, as all goods bound for France were to be denied to the Republican foe. With Marseille, Toulon, and other southern communities reliant on imported food, the plan was simple. Hunger would imperil the revolutionary government and cripple its armies in the field. Yet, as successful as this policy proved to be, the British blockade was just the latest hardship for the people of Toulon. Prior to the expansion of the Revolutionary War, the Mediterranean community was already a harbour of discontent. In fact, with a history defined by turbulence and bloodshed, the town's fortunes, or lack thereof, is unlike anything we've yet seen. So, in this episode, we're going to meet the great naval port of Toulon, its unusual character, its atypical composition, and its less than idyllic experience of the French Revolution. From violent lynchings to claims of civil war, at times this will be a gruesome affair. But Toulon will also surprise you in the most unexpected of ways. Having met the grand French arsenal, we will then reconnect with the British next episode as they make contact with insurrectionary Toulon. To start us off, it is always worth an introduction. Settled permanently during the Roman Republic, Toulon's history is considerably different to its nearby neighbour Marseille. As we know, the latter became a bustling commercial centre, but Toulon remained a humble community on the Mediterranean coast. At the end of the 16th century, Toulon numbered perhaps just 5,000 souls, compared to Marseille at nearly 10 times that number. So why had Marseille blossomed while Toulon languished? Although famed for its two natural harbours, Toulon's geography had actually hampered its trading potential. Immediately to the town's north rests Mount Ferron, a large mountain which blocks easy access to the region's hinterland. Combined with a lack of suitable rivers connecting it with the interior, well, trade and Toulon were just never meant to be. However, in 1599, the fortunes of the town changed immensely. Blessed with two natural harbours, which offered some of the best anchorages in the entire Mediterranean, Toulon was selected by King Henry IV to be the home of a new naval facility. Henceforth, Toulon would be the focus of French naval interests in the Mediterranean, and the town would have the infrastructure to prove it. Over time, the French would establish a mighty naval arsenal, complete with dockyards, fortifications, and of course a large and powerful fleet. By the time of the Revolution, this once sleepy settlement had been transformed into a bustling town of perhaps 30,000 people, placing it in the top 30 largest communities in the nation. But this transformation of Toulon, built on the back of French naval interests, had considerable impacts on the local community. The Toulon of old had been overhauled into something altogether different, and something quite unique as well. Indeed, the domineering presence of the Navy, and thus government expenditure, had three key consequences for the character of Toulon. Firstly, Toulon's physical nature was modified to reflect its newfound importance. While Marseille rested some 30 miles or 50 kilometres to the northwest of Toulon, the county of Nice was less than 100 miles to the east. Consequently, Toulon was exposed. In the 18th century, Austrian forces had crossed the frontier and besieged the town. In response to this vulnerability, the French government not only built the dockyards and an arsenal, but also the town's significant fortifications. However, as Toulon's population boomed in that century, its walls naturally remained fixed. The result was a community that was overcrowded, to say the least. As historian Jules Michelet describes it, Toulon was a town strangled by its own defences. With space now at a premium, the municipality became cramped, noisy, and the very definition of unhygienic. Local authorities would try modest measures to help beautify the town, but its compact nature was now part of the community's DNA. Historian Fernand Braudel paints a vivid picture. For several years, there were trees and open spaces inside the new walls. Then, the gaps were filled in, and houses at once spilled over into 5 or 6 suburbs, which were equally close packed. Improvements later made to the ramparts did not remedy the original cramped layout. By the beginning of the 18th century, the town still consisted of a maze of absurdly narrow streets, winding their way to dead ends or dangerous alleyways, with open sewers and noxious smells everywhere. The incredibly narrow houses, one room to a story, rose vertically into the air and were propped up by external pillars, themselves supported by beams overhanging the streets and the heads of passers-by. There was nowhere to assemble the troops, apart from one open space, known as the battlefield. So, here we have a cramped and chaotic centre that warped itself to fit the walls that encircled it. But it was also what those walls protected which framed the urban space, or perhaps more accurately, lack thereof. Not only did the arsenal's defences strangle the town, but the arsenal itself was a dominant footprint within. From the docks to the foundries to the warehouses, the space required to manufacture and repair ships was no small quantity. An individual ship consumed several thousand oak trees, let alone additional materials such as metal, hemp, and other types of timber. Thus, in Toulon, we have a municipality whose physical identity was defined by the presence of the French Navy. From its outer walls to the docks they sheltered, what little space remained became the domain of tall and narrow houses, connected by a maze of alleyways which were woven in between. This was a community moulded by its arsenal. This was a town shaped by the sea. Yet, if the first impact of the royal arsenal was the town's physical transformation, the second consequence was a fundamental rewiring of the local economy. As Britain and France battled for supremacy throughout the 18th century, government funds poured into the navy, and by association, Toulon. It was the royal treasury that built infrastructure, commissioned ships, repaired vessels, and imported the vast supplies necessary for this construction extravaganza. Furthermore, it was also government money, which paid everyone from the officers and sailors in the navy to the dozens of professions which toiled to craft these floating Goliaths. Thus, the entire economy was dependent on two things: war and the national government. Peacetime often brought recessions as naval expenditure reduced. But so long as spending didn't completely evaporate, the inhabitants could generally ride out these counter-cyclical booms and busts. Thankfully, by the time of the Revolution, it's not like a bankruptcy crisis could possibly endanger this critical source of economic prosperity. Finally, the presence of Toulon's arsenal helped to craft a unique social composition. Compared to both Marseille and Lyon, there were notable differences in the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie, and the popular classes of the Third Estate. For the nobility, the presence of so many naval officers created a peculiar situation. More than 400 of the Navy's officers resided in Toulon during the 1780s, meaning that more than 1% of the population were naval officers alone. Combined with officers from the army and members of the aristocracy more broadly, what we have here in Toulon is a situation where the Second Estate was disproportionately represented. In fact, ridiculously so. In the census of 1765, 9% of heads of households were nobles. For comparison, that figure was closer to 1% in nearby Marseille. Furthermore, you may recall that in Marseille, the preeminence of mercantile elites blurred the distinction between the nobility and the upper crust of the third. The same was not true for Toulon. With so many nobles employed by the armed services, and the town's opportunities for mercantile elites comparatively limited, the bonds of marriage and mutual interest present in Marseille simply didn't exist in Toulon. In fact, many officers didn't even have ties to the town itself. Less than 15% of Toulon's naval officers were born in the town, with many coming from across the nation. Consequently, few actually settled, leaving their families in other parts of the kingdom while they were stationed in the south. And to be clear, this occurred in the overwhelming majority of cases. Records suggest that fewer than 10% of active officers resided with their wives and family in Toulon. This created a weird situation where the local nobility was prominent, powerful, but also transient and interested in local affairs for professional purposes. Whereas most nobles were members of their community and thus proactively sought both status and influence, here in Toulon we have an aristocracy that was keen to isolate themselves from their lesser neighbours. With few intending to establish themselves permanently, most nobles paid little interest in monopolising the offices of the local municipality. However, the relative disinterest of Toulon's military elite did not result in friendly relations with the bigwig notables of the Third Estate. Far from it. In fact, French historian Maurice Agulon argues that Toulon was perhaps the only town in Provence where the nobility and the Third Estate were clearly separated. Lacking what Agulon describes as good neighbourliness between the nobility and the upper bourgeoisie, we should naturally ask, why was this the case? Well, the transient nature of much of the nobility discouraged the solidarity that might have otherwise emerged from, say, intermarriage or long-term mutual interests. But more importantly, by the time of the Revolution, Toulon had seen a century-long power struggle between the military and the municipal elite. You see, while the aristocracy did not occupy the municipal government, that did not mean that the military did not exert considerable influence in local affairs. Indeed, the growing dominance of the town's arsenal led to direct conflicts between the military and the municipality. From the perspective of the former, officers had no need to lower themselves into the town's politics, as they argued that the civilian authorities should simply do as they're told. Regularly intervening in civilian affairs, the military had a simple but potent excuse: national security. Unsurprisingly, this infuriated the notables of the Third Estate, who were keen to protect the historic independence and privileges of the municipality. Conveniently, this also meant protecting their own position within it. As the arsenal grew bigger, so too did the tensions. Opportunities were plentiful for the two administrations to conflict. Harsh words and the occasional brawl were not uncommon, and historian Agulon paints a picture of two competing upper classes of Toulon. With a town strangled by its own fortifications, it would be fair to say that there was insufficient room for the both of them. Things came to a head in 1774, when local tensions combined with other factors to produce a minor municipal rebellion. Some local officials even attempted to purge the municipality of those appointed by, and loyal to, the royal administration. Unsurprisingly, the Crown protected its own, and, faced with adjudicating local squabbles, the court generally sided with the Navy. After all, the royal administration needed no excuse to indulge in its centralizing tendencies, and, if it did, it just so happened that military preparedness was a fantastic justification for reducing regional autonomy. Consequently, during the disturbances of 1774, the court dismissed much of the civilian administration, siding once again with the military. So, Toulon had a disproportionately large and unusually transient military elite, which did not directly dominate the municipal council. But, because of the size of the arsenal, the military still dominated municipal affairs, resulting in considerable ill will between leading members of the Second and Third Estates. Come the Revolution, this would be an important point. Speaking of the Third Estate, it's worth exploring how this unique situation in the aristocracy naturally had implications for the Third. Let's start with the upper echelons of the commons, these municipal elites who bitterly resented the growing influence of the arsenal. Whereas Lyon's nobility had jealously guarded its control over the municipal council, in Toulon, the Third Estate were the dominant force. Like other towns in Provence, the participation of local notables had been a long-standing tradition. But after 1776, a new town charter actually enlarged the Third's participation in local politics, and in fact, actively required it. Henceforth, a whole host of professions were guaranteed a seat at town hall. This included barristers and notaries, but also surgeons, doctors, goldsmiths, drapers, grocers, and even silk retailers. Now, this diverse list of professions reflects Toulon's unique identity, and it does so in ways you might not expect. Firstly, with the nobility largely disinterested in participating directly in the municipal government, the seats were not automatically occupied by members of the mercantile community. That community was simply less prominent here than, say, nearby Marseille. Remember, Toulon had never been a major trading centre, and the real money for enterprising merchants was generally to be found next door, with its superior concentration of capital, resources, and networks. Secondly, the presence of the arsenal meant that some professions, like doctors and surgeons, were overrepresented compared to the average urban centre. Consequently, some of these more respectable professions now found themselves with guaranteed representation in municipal affairs. I say respectable because the logic of prominence didn't always hold true. As a military arsenal, Toulon naturally had a disproportionately high number of sex workers who, surprise surprise, did not have a voice on the council. Well, at least not directly. Finally, the recent empowerment of these bourgeois professions is itself reflective of the social tensions of 18th century Toulon. The town charter had empowered many of these professions, but the new government of King Louis XVI had not done so out of the goodness of its heart. Combined with the unpopular reforms of the final years of King Louis XV's reign, relations between military and municipal elites had become irreparably dysfunctional by the early 1770s. As such, the Crown dismissed most of the municipality, and some scholars argue that the new town charter of 1776 was a deliberate attempt to water down the influence and autonomy of the traditional municipal elites. The inclusion of doctors, surgeons, goldsmiths, silk retailers, etc., was an attempt to defang the civilian administration, and by association, empower its military rival. Thus, the Third's participation in municipal affairs was not always what it appeared on the surface. So, unlike Lyon, here in Toulon, the upper echelons of the Third Estate were actively involved in municipal affairs. And, unlike Marseille, these individuals varied greatly from the stock standard cookie cutter template of merchants and notables. But, while the clout of the Third's elite was considerable, it was under threat, and the internal divisions were significant. In particular, those from families who had long dominated local politics bitterly resented the increasing supremacy of the military and were keen to reassert civilian control and autonomy, which of course was code for their own control and autonomy. Maybe, just maybe, the revolution was their chance. Of course, the inescapable presence of the navy naturally impacted the composition and character of the town's popular classes. As in other cities of France, this broad category included everyone from artisans to apprentice craftsmen and shopkeepers and clerks through to unskilled labourers and the surrounding peasantry. Now, in some trades, life looked similar-ish to the situation elsewhere. Specialist professions were at times dominated by guilds and master craftsmen. The latter were often themselves small employers, possessing modest amounts of wealth. In this situation, which existed for, say, the tailors and the stonemasons, there wasn't a huge difference from, say, the master weavers of Lyon. But, as per usual, the navy could not be ignored, as the government employed a substantial proportion of the popular classes. Even in peacetime, roughly half of the popular classes worked for the arsenal, and those employed included a wide assortment of skilled professionals through to the less experienced. Shipbuilders, locksmiths, painters, drillers, chalkers, carvers, toolmakers, sailmakers, rope makers, pulley makers, in fact, pretty much every sort of maker seemed to be present. On top of that, you of course had prison labourers, prison guards, prison wardens, soldiers, sailors, officers, and various administrative officials such as clerks and bureaucrats. So, there's a reason why the arsenal represented half the town's employment. Now, this created all sorts of distortions, because in the arsenal there were no guilds, nor were the master artisans self-employed. Instead, those veterans were often wage earners themselves, creating a unique situation more akin to modern factories. And modern is the optimal word, complete with ringing bells, complementary healthcare, insurance schemes, and a public sector pay packet that often lagged the private sector. This was a dynamic very recognizable to the modern eye. So, for that matter, was the increasing focus on cost cutting as the revolution approached. In the final years of the old regime, the government's precarious finances accelerated the adoption of subcontracting, which, unsurprisingly, lowered both pay and conditions. More on that in a moment. In short, this unique situation in Toulon was modern. There's no other word for it. Some historians liken the workers of Toulon's arsenal to the working proletariat of the 19th and 20th centuries. Indeed, historian Ernst Labrousse explicitly describes the lower echelons of the popular classes as a quasi-proletariat. Keeping with the modern theme, others, like historian Maurice Agulon, are keen to emphasize the sheer scale of this operation, an unprecedented situation for a French community prior to the Industrial Revolution. In one interesting comparison, some scholars even claim that Toulon's arsenal was essentially a forerunner to the company towns of the 20th century, where a single manufacturer acted as the backbone for an entire town's economy. But I've taken the time to explain this, not only because it's interesting, but because it shapes Toulon's third estate. Like the predominance of a single commodity in Lyon, the predominance of a single employer in Toulon created all sorts of issues. This was particularly true in the years prior to the revolution. Irrelevant of whether one worked in the arsenal or for smaller private workshops, by 1789 all had suffered the economic insecurity brought by years of peace, looming bankruptcy, and a government intent on minimizing what little cash it had to spend. Demobilization and reduced expenditure naturally followed the end of the American Revolutionary War in 1783. The result was a localized recession, placing many workers and their families on the brink of hunger and poverty. This situation was made worse by two factors: the aforementioned subcontracting and the government's bankruptcy crisis. Regarding the former, the introduction of subcontracting in already difficult times merely amplified the pain. In January 1789, one naval officer recorded his concerns, as the practice was resulting in completely unrealistic prices. With such little work available, contractors offered ridiculous bids in an attempt to secure employment. According to the concerned official, the consequence was that chosen subcontractors employed fewer personnel, and only the most skillful. Unemployment was on the rise. Furthermore, with the government out of money, government paychecks were soon equally shortcoming. By late 1788, as the nation prepared for the Estates General the following May, Toulon's arsenal was months behind its payments to both day labourers and contractors. With a population experiencing high unemployment, high bread prices, and the general unrest of the pre-revolutionary era, this was a recipe for trouble. In short, as the dominance of one government employer mixed with the unique financial, economic, social, and political circumstances of 1789, well, I'm sure you can imagine that Toulon was hardly a harbour of tranquility. With the revolution in full swing by the summer of 1789, Toulon's experience was naturally shaped by its relationship with the government. A full account of Toulon's revolutionary experience is not the purpose of this episode, but I do want to continue to focus on some meaningful variations from the traditional revolutionary script. These both define the town's unique and violent history, as well as its eventual participation in the Federalist revolts. The first topic to note relates to aristocratic conspiracy. As demonstrated by the failed municipal resistance of 1774, the elites of Toulon's Third Estate had long resented the growing power of the service aristocracy. But after decades of setbacks and defeats, the revolution provided a rare chance to reverse their waning influence. In the wake of the storming of the Bastille, fears of reactionary plots gripped the country. The so-called Great Fear terrified the nation, and Toulon was by no means immune. In fact, with its disproportionate number of not only noble residents, but specifically military officers, the town quickly became paranoid by the enemy within. As rumours swirled of a conspiracy to slaughter the townsfolk, the home of at least one prominent officer was searched for stores of hidden weapons. Seizing on these fears, as well as perceptions that the military elite were hostile to the revolution, municipal officials renewed their long-running struggle for the mastery of Toulon. Tapping into the unrest that had accompanied the revolution, the authorities enlarged the new town militia and used it to bolster their own position. Trouble with the navy quickly followed. Now wielding a force of several thousand militiamen, The town hall was ready to challenge the arsenal's supremacy. Some officers, already disgruntled with the revolution, made this an even easier endeavour. Scandalously, one officer donned the black cockade of Austria, indicating support for Queen Marie Antoinette and, worryingly, the old regime. Worse still, naval authorities even attempted to ban the wearing of the tricolour cockade. Surely, between the patriotic municipality and this clearly suspect aristocracy, the choice for the Commune's leadership was clear. Eventually, and I do mean eventually, the notables of the Third would claim victory in this generational struggle for local control. Ultimately, the National Assembly decreed that the civilian authorities should govern both Toulon and its arsenal. Thus, in their decades-long feud, the Third Estate had finally triumphed. Well, partially. You see, I chose my words carefully, because it was the Third, and not so much the municipal elite, that found themselves triumphant. As we've seen elsewhere in France, municipal revolutions swept the nation in the second half of 1789. Toulon was no exception. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise. After all, in other cities, such as Lyon, the nobility dominated local affairs, and the revolution opened municipal office for the ambitious bourgeoisie. But in Toulon, the upper echelons of the Third already had sizable representation in the municipality. Remember, everyone from doctors to silk retailers had guaranteed participation, along with the traditional municipal elite. It's for this reason that historian Maurice Agulon asserts that Toulon had no need for a municipal revolution, as the bourgeoisie were already at the pinnacle of the local government. However, despite this, Toulon nevertheless experienced a municipal revolution. With the town's oligarchy denounced for being too exclusive, a new committee was popularly elected, and this committee governed alongside the existing municipality. Elected to this committee were not traditional notables, but a combination of fresh faces and well-known radicals. Needless to say, this was not what the local elites had in mind when they dreamt of restoring the traditional status of the town's municipality. When they had championed the powers of the municipal government, it had also meant their power within that government. As such, historian Michael Crook argues that the revolution produced significant setbacks for Toulon's historic elite. Crook writes, its manner of election and the composition of the committee both represented a setback for the Toulonnais patriciate. As the monarchy collapsed, instead of reasserting its traditional autonomy, the old elite was obliged to share power with shopkeepers and artisans. There was a clear division between conservative notables and other groups within the Third Estate, which resulted in a significant transfer of power during the summer of 1789. The committee was initially subordinate rather than superior to the existing council, but within 3 months, committee and council had coalesced to form a single municipal administration. In short, while the municipal elites of Toulon may have been gaining at the expense of their aristocratic rivals, they were losing, far more decisively, to challengers from within their own estate. But come 1790, the history of Toulon takes an unexpected and rather quirky turn, and the origins of this abnormality are probably not what you expect. As discussed previously, prior to the revolution, Toulon's municipality had been the domain of elite commoners. Consequently, the municipality's elites had taken opportunities to warp Toulon's taxation system to their advantage. Unusually, Toulon's residents avoided many of the kingdom's direct taxes, including some taxes on land. Instead, a series of indirect taxes were used to generate the lost revenue. Practically speaking, this exempted local elites from a sizable tax bill, but it also exposed poorer citizens to increased levies, primarily on foodstuffs. Now, why am I talking about taxes? Well, in 1789, the National Assembly introduced the distinction of active and passive citizens. Only active citizens would be given the right to participate in elections. And in order to be an active citizen, you had to pay the value of 3 days of local wages in direct taxes. This was a problem because in Toulon there were no direct taxes. As such, would the entire community be classified as passive citizens? Would the whole town be denied political rights? Well, as humorous as that would be, no. In fact, quite the opposite. Because of the prominence of indirect taxes on necessities such as food, it was decided that every male aged 25 and older was automatically an active citizen. Furthermore, not only were they eligible to vote, but it was also agreed that they met the much higher requirements to run for office. Thus, from the outset of the revolution, we have in Toulon universal male suffrage and full political participation. From the very beginning, dock workers, sailmakers, labourers, artisans, sans-culottes had the ability to vote in elections and run for office. As such, in Toulon, we have a tremendously unique situation. Not only do we have a town dominated by thousands of workers, who some historians liken to the proletariat of later centuries, but these citizens had the right to vote. Bypassing years of contentious debate, this unique circumstance had considerable consequences. Grey History needs your help. This podcast is only possible thanks to the amazing people supporting the show. Enjoy ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks by joining the community and doing your part to keep Grey History on the air. I'm doing everything I can to bring you more of the show you've come to love, but I can't keep doing it without your support. There's links in the show notes, on the website, and the new Apple Podcast subscription, which includes early access. So help be the change you want to see and help create independent history that isn't black and white. Help Grey History today. Now, it would be reasonable for you to presume, given all that I have said, that Toulon soon became a leading centre for radical Jacobinism. After all, this is a community with a huge concentration of agitated workers, fearful of everything from their aristocratic neighbours to the perils of unemployment and the hunger that inevitably followed. Furthermore, these citizens possessed the right to both vote and run for office. They were, in a sense, unimpeded by the institutional obstacles which disenfranchised their peers across the country. Obstacles that the National Assembly had very deliberately created to disempower people like them. Well, intense Jacobinism was indeed the end result, but so too was intense opposition. While the process was neither immediate nor linear, by late 1790, Toulon's Third Estate had begun to exert itself as a considerable political force. Historian Michael Crook looks to the emergence of a new political society in explaining the origins of the Third's rapid political awakening. For simplicity, I'll refer to this society as the Toulon Jacobin Club, a practice applied by most historians due to the body's affiliation with the Jacobin Club in Paris. Like many political societies, the club's members were originally drawn from the bourgeoisie. However, with no distinction between active and passive citizens, it took only a few months before members of the popular classes joined the party. With the club's membership growing quickly, so too did its role in local politics. In Lyon, we saw how neighbourhood societies collaborated amongst themselves to dominate local elections. A similar dynamic occurred in Toulon, this time led by one singular club. Slowly, but surely, the increasingly organised Jacobins exerted their influence. Within a year, Jacobin allies had been installed throughout the National Guard, won the mayor's office, secured judicial positions, and had a sizable representation in various elected bodies. Going to great lengths to mobilise voters in the poorest parts of the city, the Jacobins were scoring success after success. But the town's political society was not just winning elections, it was simultaneously redefining the very nature of political activity. Championing the merits of direct democracy, the Jacobins consistently demanded that the sections be consulted on major municipal issues. This was a relatively radical stance even amongst the nation's various Jacobin societies. In doing so, the club's advocacy created an important precedent. Henceforth, sectional participation in local politics was considered the accepted norm, a norm that would later become pivotal in the Federalist revolts. Yet, if universal male suffrage accelerated the emergence and radicalism of Toulon's Jacobins, it also hastened the creation of an organised opposition. As early as the start of 1791, leading members of Toulon's elites were consolidating into a broad anti-Jacobin coalition. Its members included notables, merchants, manufacturers, and other individuals connected to either the military or municipal elite. Interestingly, it also included some artisans and shopkeepers, although poorer members of the popular classes, such as dock workers and sailors, were strikingly absent. Also absent were the political affiliations we've seen in other anti-Jacobin coalitions. In both Lyon and Marseille, Girondins, and to a lesser extent Feuillants, played leading roles in opposing local Jacobin municipalities. But Toulon's anti-Jacobin movement emerged all the way back at the dawn of 1791. In January 1791, the Feuillants didn't even exist, nor the Girondins, nor the Montagnards. At this point in time, we're still more than a year and a half away from the fall of the monarchy, and almost 2 years away from the formation of anti-Jacobin coalitions in larger southern cities. To put it simply, Toulon was experiencing the revolution at double speed. The presence of universal male suffrage meant that Toulon was years ahead of its peers. This was the case both in terms of witnessing the ascendancy of radical Jacobinism and also in seeing the emergence of a powerful anti-Jacobin opposition. Now, I'm sure it won't surprise you that the formation of this organised opposition naturally created problems. In fact, by August 1791, the National Assembly was receiving reports of civil war in Toulon. Those reports, it turns out, were nothing compared to the summer of 1792. Remembered by locals as the horrible quarter, the entire season is known for scenes of horrific bloodshed. So, with talk of civil war in the great Mediterranean arsenal, what was going wrong in Toulon? By June 1791, tensions were near breaking point. Controversial elections had seen yet more Jacobin success, and anti-Jacobin forces were accused of colluding to nullify these gains. With allegations of electoral shenanigans flying thick and fast, it appeared that things could quickly get out of hand. But as the end of the month approached, the unthinkable occurred. King Louis XVI had escaped. As we've seen elsewhere, the flight to Varennes changed the game. With Toulon still home to so many military officers, fear was a natural response. The king's flight was believed to herald an invasion from an émigré army, and the frontier with Piedmont Sardinia was dangerously close. Facing the threat of counter-revolution, Toulon's factions united. To be clear, these fears were unfounded, but the belief in a possible invasion inspired unity nonetheless. Surprisingly, in the turbulent weeks that followed, Toulon's Jacobins even adopted a conservative position on constitutional matters. Far from demanding the king's dethronement, as some were doing in Paris, the club actually denounced the troublemakers who they blamed for the Champ de Mars massacre the following month. Keen to outdo their rivals, leading anti-Jacobins embraced the embattled monarchy, explicitly condemning the anarchy associated with republican ideas. For the briefest of moments, peace had returned to Toulon. Yet this peace was only momentary. With blood spilt in the capital, Paris was gripped by the so-called tricolour terror. The anti-Jacobins of Toulon seized on this reaction to renew their months-long quest to establish a separate political society. Originally, local authorities had consistently denied this wish, fearing the consequences of two rival clubs in such a small community. However, with the new Fillon Club breaking from the Jacobins in July 1791, local authorities could hardly prevent the formation of a second society in Toulon. Unfortunately for the town's authorities, they were right to worry. With the formal creation of a rival institution, divisions promptly re-emerged between the Jacobins and their opponents. With the panic of the king's flight subsiding, disputes over electoral results once again splintered the community. Both sides organised demonstrations, and disorder was the result. By August 1791, violence was the norm. Troublingly, the National Guard was also divided, resulting in ineffective policing, to say the least. On the 23rd of August, an armed demonstration against the arrest of a few Jacobins resulted in the factions of the National Guard firing upon each other. Out of desperation, the army was called in, and martial law was eventually declared. So turbulent was the situation that it remained in effect for 2 weeks. The dead numbered perhaps as few as 7, but for a horrified National Assembly, that was beside the point. Here was one of the most important military installations in the country, consumed by violent unrest. Some even considered the town to be gripped by class war. Ultimately, the upheavals would settle in the second half of 1791, but not without additional elections and yet more tension. The winter of 1791-92 provided an opportunity for calm. With the Legislative Assembly now in place and the Brossoans championing calls for war, the residents of Toulon could unite once more against a common threat. That threat was of course not only the émigrés and the monarchs of Europe which lurked beyond the frontier, but also the enemy within. With roughly half of Toulon's naval officers refusing to re-enlist by March 1792, the result was even greater suspicion on those officers who remained. Fearful of the aristocratic plot which no doubt endangered the city, searches of homes and correspondence became increasingly common. Not even the Navy's commandant was above suspicion, with his home also searched for incriminating evidence. Perhaps unsurprisingly, no proof of treason was uncovered, but the very occurrence of these investigations merely inflamed misgivings and mistrust. The outbreak of war soon exacerbated tensions, not only between the populace and the armed services, but also between the town's Jacobin and anti-Jacobin factions. High bread prices, inflation, a disastrous war effort, all of these factors frayed the thinly held peace. Perhaps more so than anything else, it was the fate of the monarchy which became the principal point of division. In a town paranoid by aristocratic conspiracies, Louis XVI's continued use of the veto to protect émigrés and priests was a particularly egregious act. After months of escalating rhetoric, by July 1792, Toulon's Jacobins finally demanded dethronement. This was a far cry from its passionate defence of the monarchy just 12 months prior. The embrace of republicanism renewed the town's disunity. Local conservatives were dismayed by reports of anarchy in the capital and saw republican agitation in Toulon as nothing short of treason. The feeling was mutual. The Jacobins replied that not only was a purge of the monarchy necessary, but also of the department, district, judiciary, and any other institution which had proven itself insufficiently loyal to the revolutionary cause. Shockingly, this purge was pursued literally. In the summer of 1792, bloodshed became the norm. Known to locals as the Horrible Quarter, the season saw a wave of violence which foreshadowed the September massacres in Paris. In late July, the disorder commenced near La Valette, on the outskirts of Toulon. A non-constitutional priest was murdered in cold blood, while the home of a prominent anti-Jacobin was ransacked the same day. Pro-Jacobin demonstrations soon broke out, and in the upheaval which followed, 4 departmental officials were hung from lampposts. These impromptu lynchings were just the start. In the subsequent days, murder and mayhem defined the Mediterranean port. The victims included anti-Jacobin merchants and manufacturers, judges, and yet more public officials. These unfortunate souls were not just at the wrong place at the wrong time, but in some instances methodically pursued. One target of the mob's anger had tried to scale the city's walls in an attempt to escape his assailants. In this, he only temporarily succeeded, as he injured himself in the process. Alerted to his presence in a nearby hospital, his murderers broke in, seized him, and dragged him off to his death. The summer of 1792, this horrible quarter, would continue to see regular outbreaks of violence. Administrators, merchants, and even military officers were all murdered. Shockingly, in September, the arsenal's commandant was lynched by a crowd. These killings, which generally preceded the September massacres, were bloody, violent, and traumatizing for many in the local community. But, however chaotic these scenes were, the victims themselves were by no means random. Amongst the 20 or so dead, almost all were prominent anti-Jacobins. The politics of the deceased naturally fuels controversy. Like the September massacres, contemporaries and scholars are bitterly divided over both the interpretation and the memory of these events. For example, was this bloodletting a random outburst of violence, or was it a more calculated and contrived effort to eliminate political opponents? Historian Michael Crook suspects the former, noting in one instance the injuries sustained by prominent Jacobins as they attempted to subdue the violence. Yet French historian DMJ Henry reaches the opposite conclusion. Another expert in Toulon's affairs, Henry highlights the lack of arrests and investigations which followed these terrible disorders. For Henry, this inaction is reflective of the fact that any investigation would have incriminated leading Jacobin officials. So, as with the September massacres, a wide variety of opinions exist as to just how responsible, if at all, local Jacobins were in unleashing and perpetuating the bloodshed. Furthermore, as we saw in Paris, it's also quite an easy task to find defenders for these gruesome acts. While some historians lament scenes of egregious criminality, one Jacobin contemporary presented a different and unapologetic perspective. In the difficult circumstances facing us, the Jacobins of Toulon preferred tough to tender action. Feuillants and reactionaries received their just deserts. I wonder if this Jacobin would be so flippant if he knew what awaited him in 1793. Thank you for listening to episode 70, Toulon, a Harbour of Discontent. In the next episode, we'll see Toulon's Federalist Revolt and its defection to the Allied cause. We'll also see the initial battles for control over the vital port and the challenges facing both the besiegers and the besieged. To say that I'm excited would be an understatement. As always, thank you so much to those people supporting the show. And if you're not yet a member of Grey History, then please do your part to keep Grey History on the air. There's links in the show notes, on the website, and now there's a subscription offer available directly in Apple Podcasts. Between now and the next episode, please find the chance to recommend the show to friends, family, or strangers on the internet. One final welcome to the newest members of the community, and a special shout out again to the heroically generous heroes of the revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin, Scott, Howard, Fernando, and Hilberto. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day.